start on lunch might cause people to filter in a little bit later. My name is Jeremy Grossman. I'm at the University of Georgia, and I'll be reading each paper title before the paper, and then we'll do them all, and then we'll have questions. And this is the last one, so we know how it goes. First, we've got Sarah Marshall, and her paper is entitled "A Recounting, Arendt and Kristeva Descent to the Myth of Orpheus and Eurydice."
Thank you. In the 10th book of the Metamorphoses, Ovid recounts the well-known tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. Hymen, the god of marriage, is said to have presided over the couple's wedding ceremony in vain, as he did not afford his customary blessings. Even Hymen's torch failed to light properly and sputtered with tear-provoking fumes. These foreboding omens of a failed union were soon consummated in Eurydice's fated death and Orpheus's backward look, returning her to the grips of the underworld. In the Gorgics, Virgil details her descending lament as she demands of Orpheus, "What madness has destroyed myself in you?" Kristeva investigates this madness, which perpetually sacrifices femininity and the body to egoic thought, in the first volume of her Female Genius trilogy, where she attends to Hannah Arendt's use of the Orpheus myth to reconsider Arendt herself as a challenge to the authority of the Western tradition. Following Kristeva's call to recount the dissensing that makes Arendt's thought possible, this essay attempts to resurrect the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice through a reading of two thinkers who champion differential negotiation as the only salvation for a fractured human condition. So first I'll discuss Arendt's interpretation of the myth, and then Kristeva's interpretation of Arendt's interpretation of the myth. So first Arendt. In the thinking volume of The Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt invokes the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice to illustrate an imaginative desensing that allows for the possibility of thought. Just now, she elucidates, I chose to speak first of desensed sense objects, that is, of invisibles belonging to the world of appearances that have temporarily disappeared from or have not yet reached our field of perception and are drawn into our presence by remembering or anticipation. What actually occurs is told for all time in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus went down to Hades to recover his dead wife, and he was told he could have her back on the condition that he would not turn to look at her as she followed him. But when they approached the world of the living, Orpheus did look back, and Eurydice immediately vanished. More precisely than could any terminological language, the old myth tells what happens the moment the thinking process comes to an end in the world of ordinary living. All the invisibles vanish again. In the sections leading up to this illustration, Arendt begins by affirming the autonomy of mental activities in relation to the life and world from whence they arise. Men, and this is her usage throughout, but I kept it because this is part of Kristeva's critique. Men have the capacity to transcend worldly conditions in thinking, willing, and judging, that is, in mental life, though never in reality. It is this unconditional mental life, Arendt stresses, that engenders worldly actions capable of impacting reality. Still, she characterizes inner life by an invisibility with respect to the world of appearances shared with others in speech and action. Inner life is, for Arendt, divided between the activities of the mind and the sufferings of the soul. Both are non-visible, yet the activities constitutive of the mind are self-made, within one's control, and can be stopped or started at will. While the sufferings constitutive of the soul are the result of the world's impositions and comprise a more or less chaotic welter of happenings, from whence passions, feelings, and emotions arise, showing themselves in the world through and despite the individual. A mental act, moreover, does not rest content with what it is given. Rather, it always transcends the world of appearances and transforms the object into an experiment of the self with itself. And this reflexivity, Arendt finds an inherent duality in the nature of consciousness. For her, passive self-awareness accompanies all mental activities, actualizing an original split between me and myself. The active component of consciousness, what she calls the thinking ego, is only conscious of and through its activity. It immediately disappears as though it were a mere mirage when the real world asserts itself again. Such a disappearing act seems to have its own reflexivity for Arendt. The thinking ego transcends the world of appearances, transforming its objects, be they sensory or affective, and becoming conscious of itself through its willful activity of self-experimentation. The world, however, ceaselessly impinges upon this invisible realm, requiring that consciousness abandon its transformative musings to contend with reality. Yet Arendt goes on to explore a more fundamental abandonment that makes this mental activity possible. A deliberate withdrawal from appearances inaugurates mental activities. Every mental act, she stresses, rests on the mind's capacity of having present to itself what is absent from the senses. For Arendt, a special concern for the general motivates a renunciation of the world which is always presented in multitudinous particularity. It is the work of thinking, in an imaginative act of representation, which transforms an actually absent visual image into a present invisible image. Thinking, Arendt explains, must prepare the particulars given to the senses in such a way that the mind is able to handle them in their absence. It must, in brief, de-sense them. Thus, not only do worldly demands dissolve the conscious self-experimentings of the thinking ego, thinking itself presupposes a renunciation of the world's sensible particularity as a condition for its imaginary activity. Nevertheless, what is done in response to the urgencies of everyday life ultimately depends for Arendt on mental activities, that is, on the principles by which we act and the criteria by which we judge and conduct our lives. The visible things we must do in the world of appearances are founded upon a withdrawal into invisible mental life, which is in turn made possible through a disavowal of manifest reality. Arendt's account of this vacillation between presence and absence, visible and invisible, activity and passivity, power and vulnerability, and so on, recalls Freud's portrayal of his grandson's Fort Dog game, which led him to discover the death drive. In a similar fashion, Arendt's analysis leads her to a consideration of life and death. She aligns the visible shared world of doing with life, and the invisible solitary activity of the mind with death. The outstanding characteristic of mental activity is being by oneself and having intercourse with oneself as opposed to being aware of the realness of the world and self. Arendt follows a Roman idiom that depicts being alive as inter homines esse, to be among men, and death as inter homines esse desinere, to cease to be among men. For her, the plurality of a world shared with one's fellow men is one of the basic existential conditions of human life on earth. Yet she maintains that there is nothing in this ordinary life which cannot become food for thought. That is, be subjected to the twofold process of transformation that readies a sense object to become a suitable thought object. Withdrawal from the world of common sense experience arises out of the quest for meaning, manifest in men's need to tell a story of some happening they witnessed or to write poems about it. This nonetheless requires an abandonment of the common sense world of everyday speech that is shared with others. Accordingly, thinking not only introduces death to a self who is aware of its reality, it also kills the other who is removed from our presence in order to be brought back as a remembered object of thought. Arendt thus reveals that man's desire to find meaning in his real life requires him to kill himself and the other to create a life of the mind. Mental life, on the other hand, is constantly threatened with extinction from the demands of a world that requires him to maintain his existence. Ultimately, the original split in consciousness sets off a perpetual intramural war between thought, which is in its supreme expression philosophy, and common sense, which is crystallized in the figure of the Greek hero. Sensory experience, Arendt confesses, is in itself incoherent and devoid of meaning, but thinking's dominion results in the inversion of all ordinary relationships, including a reversal of life and death, near and far, past and future. The everyday world of common sense is associated with death, while the imaginary world of de-sensed recollection is exalted as real life. What is actually close at hand is removed from presence in favor of a distant past now absent. The future is sacrificed to memories made present in an eternal nunc-stans that paralyzes action and the possibility of change. The perspective of the thinking ego occludes awareness of this inversion and its basis in the disavowal of common sense. It is rather as though the invisible had come forward, Arendt explains, as though the innumerable entities making up the world of appearances, which through their very presence direct the mind and prevent its activity, had been positively concealing an always invisible being that reveals itself only to the mind. Thus, the thinking ego perceives the intrusion of the world as a withdrawal or oblivion of being and a collapse into meaninglessness. To return to the myth, then, Orpheus can be understood as a depiction of the thinking ego, which has withdrawn from real life in favor of the life of the mind. For him whose solitary descent into an eternal nostalgic hell, living, being, and significance consists in the disavowal of an actual shared world where meaning is present and transformative. What matters is instead an absent, but imaginatively recreated Eurydice. The demands of reality threaten this dead realm of nonsense, annihilating the invisible life that the remembering Witterer has resurrected in thought. Reality, which is normally so full of presence, life, and immediacy, is bereft of all these qualities for the mourning Orpheus. Yet, in his attempt to reject an existence devoid of meaning, he's confronted with a severe and no doubt painful reality check, the vanishing of the invisible Eurydice. Now onto Kristeva's response. Kristeva's response calls for a desensing of Arendt's analysis. The creative imagination manipulates the elements of the visible world, she notes, but only after these elements have been desensed, evaporated, killed, in a word, disappeared, like Eurydice's body, from the perceptions of sense and sight. For Kristeva, Eurydice comes to represent a sacrificing of femininity as well as bodily and psychic suffering to an Orphic imagination responsible for the life of the mind. Nevertheless, she understands Arendt's work to allow for the preservation of these traditionally sacrificed elements by making Eurydice into an Orpheus who is capable of recounting the story of desensing. She thus hints at a novel interpretation of the myth through a consideration of Arendt herself as example. Following an analysis of the human condition, in which Arendt exalts narrated action in the public sphere as constitutive of the bios politikos, Kristeva wonders about the woman in Arendt's work. And this is a longish quote. Does Arendt Orpheus demolish Hannah Eurydice? This commentary does not give the reader the impression that our author identifies with this sacrificed Eurydice, nor that she regrets Orpheus's productive imagination. Perhaps it is because the only way to save the elements of the sensory realm, and to start with femininity, is to make Eurydice into an Orpheus who's capable of recounting the story of desensing. Only in this way, through a narration of this sort, can the story of desensing somehow become sensitive to each of the participants in action. To accomplish this eminently political act, we must operate from two sides at the same time, and we must possess, of course, a healthy dose of reflective wisdom, but especially of political phronesis. In that sense, Eurydice, the sensory realm, and femininity do not evaporate under the pen of our politically minded narrator. Kristeva proposes a recounting of the myth, in which a Eurydice turned Orpheus saves the sensory realm and femininity by means of another perspective on suffering loss. This tale condenses several important themes Kristeva draws on throughout the Arendt volume. To seriously consider her proposition and create a new beginning for Orpheus and Eurydice, it will be necessary to explore themes of narration, sense and thinking, and femininity in Kristeva's work, and I'll only have the opportunity to touch on these here for the most part. To begin, let us look to Kristeva's analysis of narrative. She challenges Arendt's apparently limited account, which disparages poetry and contemporary narrative structures for their failure to seek public approval. Kristeva affirms modern literature as a revolutionary praxis which recollects the bonds between binary poles, exposes and puts into question psychic conflicts, and creates space for renewal. Life as revolt is actualized in the non-thought of writing, she asserts. Are we capable of envisioning other strains of discourse and action that would be the modern figures of this mutability, of this perceptual outburst of meaning and the senses that Arendt sought? In a direct reference to thinking, Kristeva suggests we might fault Arendt for failing to grasp that the poetic language of a narrator is a way to join the thinking ego and the self as it appears and moves in the world. More effectively than could any philosophical concept or mystical vision, poetic language of this sort can translate the Nungstans of the senses and breathe life into a recovered past. Here Kristeva champions language of poetry as a means to overcome the dualism between the withdrawn and solitary thinking ego and the present and involved self of sensory awareness in the world of others. Binding this original split would involve first a translation of the Nungstans, or the stop and think, that brackets the sensory imposition of the world, and second, it would bring together the self involved in the world of appearances and the transcendent ego lost in thought. Such a translation would make it possible to resurrect memories within the present world of sense. Further, Kristeva clearly understands Arendt's account of narration to indicate that meaning can be created in the world of appearances and not merely within an individual thinking ego. This occurs through the political disclosure of a who, an uncommon and unique individual whose story is told through the recollection of others sharing a common world. Such a disclosure still requires a withdrawal from lived experience, but this is accomplished through a shared logic of memorization which governs the means of withdrawal and the type of narrative that the community recognizes as meaningful. And yet for Kristeva, the manifestation of a who still occurs within the logical framework of the thinking ego. It is only achieved through a constant attack on biological life. She quotes Arendt, "The essence of who somebody is can only come into being when life departs, leaving behind nothing but a story." Arendt associates the private inner workings of the body with women in reproduction, and places them in opposition to the narrated disclosure of a who in the shared political sphere. Like the sufferings of the soul, woman and the body must be surrendered to the creation of a hero who is recollected in thought. Thus, even as a common sense figure, the disclosure of a who appears to preserve a dichotomous and sacrificial logic. Kristeva nonetheless contends that Arendt's reasoning is more complicated. Despite the absence of thematic considerations of femininity and the body from Arendt's corpus, Kristeva reveals their structural presence as indispensable to her unique perspective. Through a comparison of passages from the Jew as pariah and the human condition, in which Arendt acknowledges sexual difference, her own as well as that found in Genesis, to a passage from the life of the mind where she aligns the body with the given of the individual experiencing self, Kristeva illuminates an implicit assumption within Arendt's thought. The text suggests that human diversity is an essential precursor for action, with the original difference between man and woman at the very beginning of plurality. Accordingly, femininity would not be merely an individual given, but an intrinsic difference that is indispensable to the action that Arendt considered. This acknowledgement on Kristeva's reading saves Arendt's thought from the neutral, asexual universalist logic, allowing her work to inhabit the realm of incarnation, characterized by an original difference that creates the possibility for action and meaning. For Kristeva, it is Arendt's distinctly feminine vantage point that allows her to challenge philosophy while maintaining thought's necessity for life. Taking care to note the nonsense and meaningless generated in thinking's withdrawal from the world of phenomena, Kristeva points to the life of the mind and Arendt's impatient elaboration of the dichotomies to which thought gives rise. She considers Arendt's notion of desensing as constitutive of the split between thought and the real. She confirms an awareness of death as the only reality for the thinking ego withdrawn from the sensory realm. But Kristeva elaborates upon the dissolution of reality that necessarily accompanies thinking. The existence of thought is foreign to the common sense world. Bios theoretikos is a bios zynikos, she says. This fundamental estrangement of the thinker, she asserts, demands to be taken seriously. This loss of world, the strange experience of a morbid reality, is no doubt isolating, painful, destructive, and dangerous, but is also creative. Kristeva explains that the initial loss stimulates questioning concern, discursive thinking, and philosophy. Accordingly, she cautions those inclined to read Arendt as having dismissed the realm of thinking for its negativity in favor of the public world of appearances. Rather, Kristeva interprets her as highlighting the conflicts inherent in the experience of thinking, while at the same time hailing it as that which makes one fully alive. For Kristeva, Arendt's work illuminates a viable antidote to alienation. Thinking is what reveals and uncovers the split, or the duality in the thinking ego, but it also provides the most effective therapy for the thinking ego when it sustains the dialogue between the parties that constitute the split, when it can question their differences while avoiding getting stuck in any one part of the dichotomies that gave rise to this experience. I'm concluding now. For Arendt and Kristeva, division is the fundamental condition of the human experience. Kristeva reveals Arendt's genius in her championing of the bond between a thinking ego withdrawing in search of meaning and a soul suffering the force of reality in worldly interactions. This emphasis on the bond, which is created in a narrative dialogue between opposing factions, allows for a novel interpretation of the Orpheus myth to which Kristeva only hints. Telling the story anew requires a desensing, indeed all thought does. but also a recounting of that desensing, of being lost in a foreign realm, of suffering the void of meaninglessness. All of this must be brought to bear on the shared world of appearances. Kristeva's proposal challenges the authority of the thinking Orpheus to a partnership with the suffering Eurydice, where they share a joint fate. Saving the sensory realm and Eurydice also means saving egoic thought and Orpheus. A happy ending would involve a negotiating tension that appreciates difference, a Eurydicean Orpheus, or an Orphic Eurydice who is sensitive and articulate, thoughtful but passionate, vulnerable yet capable, solitary while involved. By creating another narrative, Kristeva recuperates the role of Hymen in uniting Orpheus and Eurydice and thinking beyond the sacrificial logic which has dominated the Western tradition.
I neglected to mention that Sarah is at the University of Memphis. Next, we have Markus Weidler presenting also for his co-author Mariko Izumi, both, I'm assuming, at Columbus State University. The paper is titled "The Cost of Critique, Intervention, and Ethical Violence in Benjamin Kristeva."
Thank you, and thanks for having me. One little disclaimer: because the paper was originally co-authored, it is written in the first person plural, and I left it at that. It's not my illusions of grandeur or any majestic sort of pronouncements. That's where the "we" comes from. Okay. Most of the times throughout the paper, when I say intervention, it has this double meaning: invention, intervention, but I just pronounce it intervention. By way of introduction, let's look at these two theorists joining forces. As Alice Jardine pointed out long ago, the controversial character of Julia Kristeva's work is reflected in the striking diversity of labels that critics have found for her, ranging from ultra-left-wing to conservative revolutionary. As a prima facie clue for our inquiry, this provocation of apparently contrary responses is a feature that Kristeva shares with Walter Benjamin. Benjamin is, to those who don't know, a very influential culture critic. He died in 1940, fleeing from the Nazis in sort of tragic, ironic circumstances, and he's leaving a major impact on women's studies, cultural theory, and cinematography. So Walter Benjamin, too, has been profiled as anything from communist anarchist to proto-fascist, his own status as a tragic victim of Nazism notwithstanding. In this essay, we argue that this commonality is not superficial, but rather points to something integral, if unsettling, at the heart of these two thinkers' respective project. What connects Benjamin and Kristeva in our account is a vital concern with the cost of critique, that is, with the question whether critical agency in its most productive modes is inherently related to certain forms of ethical violence. We aim to show that one of Kristeva's pivotal contributions consists in offering an alternate model of critique animated by an ethos of intervention, which is key to techniques of criticism that are both disruptive and innovative. Specifically, Kristeva's approach seeks to explore limit situations where individuals and collectives can break out of a moral deadlock only by inflicting ethical violence upon themselves, as they effectively reinvent their moral identity as well as their historically accustomed life-world coordinates. In the following, we proceed in two steps. First, we briefly sketch Judith Butler's important contributions to the project of rethinking the meaning of critique, and then import the notion of ethical violence from her book, Giving an Account of Oneself. In so doing, we aim to broach some of Butler's insights in order to clarify the Delphic proposal that practice encompasses the ethical, a leitmotif in Kristeva's writing to which Jean Graybeal has drawn attention. The kind of practice that encompasses the ethical, we argue, is explicated best in terms of choric practice in conjunction with Kristeva's account of sharing singularity. Second, to illustrate the workings as well as the ethical risks involved in such sharing, we consider the phenomenon of mystic speech as a site for the liquidation, I try not to have too many scare quotes, but liquidation of the speaking subject in the dual sense of rendering the speaking subject fluid as well as killing it. In a way to be explained, such killing is different from complete annihilation, relying heavily on the work of Dorothee Sölle, who is a German-born liberation theologian who taught in the United States for more than a decade, and I think the heyday of her productivity was in the 70s, but she's still alive and around. And Catherine Arendt. We seek to cast new light on Kristeva's and Benjamin's like-minded understanding of critical agency. Here we trace a Catholic lineage of mystic speech, qua choric practice, from the church reformer Teresa of Avila to the social gospeler and modern-day dissident Dorothy Day. Viewed from within this constellation of church politics and social activism, mystic speech will emerge as a subversive genre of devotional discourse, which mobilizes silence and tears as the kind of dangerous liquids which Kelly Oliver has scrutinized as crucial for diagnosing modern man's crisis of meaning. So how about ethical violence? Is it a threat or an opportunity? The backdrop for the present examination of the intersection between Benjamin's and Kristeva's thought is broadly Foucauldian. Provoked by Michel Foucault's commentary on critical ethos in his controversial late essay, What is Enlightenment?, social theorists and philosophers like Judith Butler and Richard Bernstein have raised the question about the very meaning of critique anew. Put in Kantian language, they have offered different models of critique informed by divergent understandings of the enabling conditions as well as limits of critical agency. Keenly alert to the complex relation between unfolding of history and the unfolding of thought, these authors part ways in their respective accounts of the performative material dimension of critique. And it is in this context that the work of Walter Benjamin and Julia Kristeva assumes its relevance for contemporary discussions pertaining to the cost of critique. Regarding the haunting notion that critique, for all its positive connotations in academia, might be inherently violent, Butler's volume Giving an Account of Oneself is of special interest. On our interpretation, Butler's discussion is instructive not despite, but because of its seemingly ambivalent stance toward ethical violence. Apparently announced by the title of the book, originally published in German under the title Kritik der ethischen Gewalt, which means critique of ethical violence, it would seem that her approach amounts to an objection to ethical violence. This is how Slavoj Žižek reads it, which I think is wrong. I mean, I love Žižek, but I think he's wrong. If so, attributing a qualified defense of ethical violence to Kristeva would put her at odds with Butler. However, while there's certainly no obligation to force Kristeva and Butler into agreement, we think that Butler's critique of ethical violence is not so much a rejection of such violence as it is a careful promotion. Butler then is not dismissing ethical violence out of hand. This becomes clear in the concluding pages of Butler's discussion, where she distinguishes between an ethics of conviction and an ethics of responsibility. The former she finds problematic due to its investment in an overly robust notion of the subject as the locus for a moral judgment, or for moral judgment making. The latter she favors as more sensitive to interpersonal connectivity away from ideological partisanship. But then crucially, she takes yet another step in her conclusion where she hints that an even more fruitful approach may have to put rhetoric over ethics, or above ethics. Without attempting any exhaustive treatment of Butler's discussion, we submit that Butler's working conception of rhetorical agency alongside or even above ethics is generally compatible with Kristeva's notion of sharing singularity. In the Life Theory volume edited by John Lectie and Maria Margaroni, Kristeva explains, quote, "Each person has the right to become as singular as possible and to develop the maximum creativity for him or herself. And at the same time, without stopping this creativity, we should try to build bridges and interfaces. That is to say, foster sharing. The religious heritage is going to lead us to rethink the idea of sharing, but without repressing singularity. This is the great challenge of the modern world," unquote. Bracketing the religious aspect for the moment, such sharing can be described as a modality of becoming, to borrow Eric Dockstadter's phrase, in the service of reconciliation, which doesn't try to establish harmony between existing subject positions marked by clashing moral convictions, but instead by opening out new spaces for encounter in language. In fact, this non-reductive notion of reconciliation steers clear of mutual assimilation as a means to establish societal integration, even if it is heralded under the banner of peacemaking and civic inclusion. In fact, reconciliation construed as rhetorical agency in Butler's sense dovetails rather nicely with what Kristeva in Strangers to Ourselves had explicated as an ethics of irreconciliation such that, quote, "Psychoanalysis is experienced as a journey into the strangeness of the other and oneself toward an ethics of respect for the irreconcilable," unquote. As a possible downside, placing rhetoric above ethics in the name of irreconciliation runs the risk of selling out, the refusal of historical commitment in the name of making time for action. This impression has prompted an accusation frequently leveled against both Butler and Kristeva, namely that they displace politics in a way that leaves their initiatives impotent in the face of institutionalized oppression and injustice. As for Kristeva, she's certainly not revolutionary in any anarchistic way that would naively want to abolish all civic infrastructure or governmental institutions. Nor does she mean to revamp traditional communitarian fantasies. Instead, the point is to break open public spaces through language in ways that would infuse them with a paradoxical kind of jouissance, namely an atheistic appreciation of the sacred. In Revolt, she said, Kristeva thus describes the enduring French legacy of May '68 as an approach which favored a non-religious sacred, a kind of radical atheism which is perhaps the only non-vulgar or dogmatic form of atheism. Exhausting transcendence in its own, this is a quote by the way, sorry. Exhausting transcendence in its own terms by liberating speech through eroticism. And she says, I'm thinking less of Fourier than of Georges Bataille. Unquote. This way of linking Bataille's name to the notion of a non-religious sacred is very suggestive, for it points toward a working conception of profane piety, as one might call it, which is resourceful in its own right and at the same time puts Kristeva's project in close proximity to Benjamin, who had joined Bataille as a member of the so-called College of Sociology that met in Paris during the 1930s. The blueprint for such profane piety is already intimated in an early fragment by Benjamin titled Capitalism and Religion, which was composed in 1921, but not published during his lifetime. Here, he critically exposes the demonic dynamics of capitalist consumer culture, which he writes, quote, capitalism is a religion of pure cult without dogma, unquote. Benjamin's crucial insight here, we take it, is that capitalism wields its soft power by streamlining people's behavior not through draconian measures, but through the homogenization of experience. That is what pure cult refers to. In this regard, Kristeva's Proust study is closest to Benjamin and Bataille when she characterizes capitalist homogenization as a, quote, shrinking of man's inner being. And here's a block quote. In renouncing being and espousing the will to social power, joy ceases to provide a possibility of rebirth for the subject and becomes alienated as a structural element. Whether he be the master or slave, man's inner being thus becomes shrunken. He closes himself to experience and becomes the stake of the forces of production of capital. In fact, the fundamental insight that Benjamin and Kristeva share is that, as a matter of principle, sensual perception and moral experience interpenetrate, which Benjamin intimates when he describes the encounter with let me skip that. Which Benjamin describes also in terms of an awakening in language. Nowhere is this more apparent than in mystic speech, which plays just as crucial a role in Benjamin's thought as it does in Kristeva's. By the way.
Oh, you read
Half
8 minutes.
Okay, that's I'm just about in halftime mode here. Okay, so let us proceed into the second half of the presentation by looking at one of those dangerous liquids which, as mentioned, Kelly Oliver suggested play a crucial role in the contemporary crisis of meaning, namely the tears of Dorothy Day. As far as we can tell, Kristeva has not openly engaged in any discussion of Dorothy Day, who died in 1980, and her discursive profile as a liminal figure in religio-political discourse, but she has become increasingly interested in Teresa of Avila, and on our reading there's a vital lineage connecting Avila to Day. While Dorothy Day's legacy has somewhat faded from public memory, she is still remembered for her editorial work for the Catholic Worker, and also for her vociferous opposition to the Vietnam War. In 1970, she embarked on a round-the-world pilgrimage, which also brought her to Calcutta, where she met Mother Teresa, who pinned the black cross worn by all members of her order on Dorothy Day's dress, an honor no other layperson ever received from her, though Day was too modest to mention it in her column. As biographer Jim Forrest relates, Day's interest in the figure of Teresa Avila was also integral both of her conversion process and of her continued existence as a quarrelsome social reformer, devoted to the gospel of the poor and the marginalized. Particularly in Day's perception, Avila had a formidable way of sharing herself, which was as encouraging as it could be unsettling. And it is here that Day's interest in Avila ties in with Kristeva's. In this incredible need to believe, Kristeva notes how Teresa of Avila had a rather unique penchant for extravagant mystical experience, and that her practice as a nun can be construed as a mental prayer of amorous fusion with God, with the which the clerical authorities eyed with suspicion, so that she was finally brought before the Inquisition. Things later on worked out better for her, and they somehow thought she could be useful for the institution, so she didn't get burned or anything. Yet the full significance of Avila's extravagant mysticism points beyond her tense relation with the religious institutions of her day. As the liberation theologian Dorothee Sölle points out, one of Avila's most important steps toward reform was the introduction of 2 hours of silent prayer daily in her newly founded convents, which put the Inquisition again on their guard. And I'm quoting Sölle here, that people might pray without moving their lips and without murmuring words appeared strange, even threatening. At stake here was a new paradoxical language use without language. As a spiritual technique, silent prayer thus emerged as a subversive form of non-language, where the emotional state of the practitioner seemed no longer regulated by the symbolically fixed meanings of official religious discourse. The Inquisition smelled heresy. Sölle explicates the paradoxical as well as potentially subversive features of silent prayer thus, quote, silence has a double meaning. I have to say Sölle is great. I mean, she always has these good one-liners. Okay, so silence has a double meaning as part of the mystical experience. On the one hand, silence is the ascetic practice of preparation, a kind of fasting from words. On the other hand, it is the self-expression of living light, unquote. And what's disconcerting to the religious establishment is that one cannot tell what exactly the silent ones are preparing for. It is never quite certain what might come out of this germinating silence. In fact, used as an alternate technique of spiritual devotion and comportment, such germinating silence, to adhere to this phrase, conveys the rich yet ominous indeterminacy that Kristeva associates with the Korah. In Catherine Arendt's felicitous formulation, quote, the Korah is a region of subjectivity which is not yet legislated into recognizable tools for gestural and verbal communication, but which is nonetheless ordered vocally and gesturally. In this sense, the choric power of silent prayer is not diminished, but rather intensified by its abundant lack of words. It is also very similar, incidentally, to what Benjamin in One Way Street called bodily presence of mind. As a case in point, Dorothy Day, too, was very adamant about the significance of prayer, both in its spoken and unspoken forms. And she once remarked, quote, prayer is as necessary to life as breathing, it's drink and food, unquote. What is more, in Day's case, we can witness yet another aspect that speaks to the choric fluidity in all its double-edged ambivalence, namely certain episodes of prolonged crying when tears kept coming out of her, sometimes for days on end. Given that Dorothy Day, for long stretches in her life, worked in the slums in New York and elsewhere, maybe Chicago, I think, one might be tempted to put these episodes of crying under the rubric of psychic venting or cathartic cleansing in response to mental strain or spiritual exhaustion. However, one can also interpret these tears as an outpouring and rechanneling of affective energy, which opens a window to rethinking the dynamics of religious self-expression and devotional discourse. In fact, we submit that these intervals are both destabilizing and regenerative. Crying in general is a disruptive happening insofar as the crying person, while being expressive of her emotions, is not available for conversation. So considered, crying says no to verbally explicit, symbolically organized communication, but not in the sense of final termination, rather as a preparation for re-entry. As Kristeva has emphasized on multiple occasions, as speaking beings, we remain tied to collective language use, which means we cannot cut off the symbolic, systematic side of language short of risking psychotic breakdowns. In this regard, then, intense crying can generate an effect similar to that of mystical silence. Hence, it is no metaphorical stretch of language to say that such tears are pregnant with meaning. The event of crying renders the corporeality of the individual and her subject position within the official grid of communication rather amorphous. It is as if the individual speaker enters into a cauldron of liquid language, where old words are recharged with new signifying power, or entirely new word creations are produced. This contention is buttressed by the fact that the heyday of European mysticism was also a period of great theopoetic creativity, as Zolle calls it. Crying, then, can be construed as a mystic technique of regeneration which opens out the kind of signifying space intimated toward the end of Kristeva's seminal essay, Women's Time. Spatially, such technique carves out a mystical domain exempt from the rules of clear and comprehensible discourse, and temporally it marks a beginning ex nihilo, if by nothingness we mean the indeterminate semiotic motility of the chora. Tweaking Judith Butler's famous expression from giving an account of oneself a bit, we can say that such interstices of crying constitute a no-scene of address, a creative meltdown of language where the speaking subject temporarily loses her contours. Disturbingly, this includes her moral contours too, which brings us back to the issue of ethical violence. Dorothy Day underwent ethical violence, we would think, when she opened herself up to devotional techniques that reshaped her experience to the point where the subject positions of her former atheistic Marxist friends were no longer available for her. Part of her experiential past had died away. Here we are once more very close to Kristeva's non-religious sacred, which in the language of intimate revolt is, quote, neither belief nor nihilism, unquote. Almost finished. Rather, Kristeva continues, quote, that it is being capable of questioning things from the place of another subject, in this apprehension of the benevolent neutrality that we obtain in the plural liquidations of plural transferences, unquote. At this point, our inquiry has come full circle, since these liquidations in mystical language instantiate the kind of ethical violence which animates Kristeva's ethics of irreconciliation, an open-ended comportment previously featured in Stabat Mater as heretics, a displacement of ethical norms onto the plane of heretical practice. In our judgment, the most delicious formulation Kristeva has thus far invented for this kind of heretical choric practice that is manifest in mystic speech is the following, which also happens to be reminiscent of Benjamin. So let me conclude with this quote from Incredible Need. At the crossroads between semiotic and symbolic, and via this impudence of enunciation that is style, sublimation communicates to the reader the impact of perception, triggering the effect of a contact with the real, an illumination even, or an oceanic feeling. Thank you.
And finally, we have Daniel Allen from Miami University of Ohio with Semiotic Unrest, Situating Loss in Kristeva's Early Dialectical Materialism.
Okay, so just to begin, this paper gets slightly fragmentary at the end, so hopefully if I break down into some sort of fit of Tourette's or something like that, you'll forgive me. But let me go ahead and just get into it. Okay, in this paper, I examine the influence of dialectical materialism on Kristeva's early account of semiotics. In Julia Kristeva, Psychoanalysis and Modernity, Sarah Beardsworth argues that there is a crucial difference in method between Kristeva's early work in Revolution in Poetic Language and the later works, the 80s trilogy, Tales of Love, Powers of Horror, and Black Sun. Beardsworth argues that Kristeva characterizes the deployment of the semiotic in Revolution in Poetic Language as a destruction of the symbolic. The symbolic order is taken as complicit with the repressive order of advanced industrial life under Beardsworth's reading, and the symbolic represses its connection to embodiment and drive motility. The deployment of the semiotic through poetic language destabilizes this complicity, making the account of semiotics in RPL a kind of praxis opposed to the symbolic order. Beardsworth argues that this account of the relationship between the semiotic and the symbolic is in tension with its use in the later works, in which everything turns on raising the semiotic to the status of the symbolic, in order to articulate a loss which cannot speak for itself. The context of this tacit suffering is not explained by a meta-narrative of oppression that valorizes one account of history over others, but arises from a ubiquitous condition of loss which Beardsworth compares to a Nietzschean account of nihilism. The problem in emphasizing the tension between these methods lies in the fact that Kristeva's only exhaustive account of semiotics comes from RPL and peripheral works of the time, which Beardsworth herself admits is somewhat problematic. So I agree with Beardsworth's account, but I take exception to her claim that the later account is not excluded. I argue that the later account is not excluded from the earlier works, but is required to understand Kristeva's Marxist influences. Turning to an early essay of Kristeva's, Semiotics, a critical science and/or a critique of science, I consider Marxist philosophy classically. I consider Marxist philosophy both in its classical terms and in terms of a new horizon, which I believe Kristeva opens, which emphasizes commodity fetishism over labor. I argue, following helpful cues from Kristeva's early essay, that by reevaluating the role played by the formation of currency and commodity fetishism in capital, Kristeva's RPL can be understood as a semiotic analysis of Marx intended to articulate a component of suffering which is at pains to express itself within the language of political economy. For Kristeva, the efficacy of Marx's crucial text lies not in a program for practice modeled off of an account of non-alienated labor, but rather in the way that capital demonstrates an unrest inherent in labor, which cannot articulate itself under the conditions of advanced industrial life. Kristeva, in fact, explains or justifies the semiotic through a semiotic analysis of Marxism designed to express the loss of the means to articulate the suffering inherent under the dominance of capital. This reading of capital also serves to provide an exemplary ground for the distinction between the semiotic and the symbolic in general. This discussion attempts to reconstruct Kristeva's semiotic analysis of Marx in order to show that the early characterization of the semiotic-symbolic distinction depends on the interests which Beardsworth only recognizes in the later texts. Okay, moving on. Kristeva's use of the semiotic in Revolution in Poetic Language is meant to destabilize a tendency in linguistic and phenomenological accounts to render meaning in arbitrary relation to the world of things which signs or intentions thematize. For Kristeva, thinkers such as Husserl, Saussure, and Lacan can find meaning within a closed system that eschews all material influence. Meaning in Saussure depends on a relation between a signifier or word and the concept it connotes rather than the thing it names. Likewise, with Husserl, at least in the logical investigations, meaning comes from the unity between the word and the ideal meaning it connotes. So, yeah, let's see. Turning to her emphasis on Freud instead, she relies on the use of the relevance of drives to the construction of meaning. So let me just jump into Freud. This is an awkward transition. For Freud, drives are a border concept between consciousness and body. They represent impulses towards some object, but the relationship is not cognitive. The drives are motivated toward the object by stimulus, an incursion from the exterior world. The object of the drives is taken to produce pleasure, which is the erasure of stimulus for Freud. He helpfully uses the language of energy to describe the drives, and that is to say, drives have a motility, but this movement is more potential than actual. An object encroaches on the body of a human being and transfers a certain amount of energy in the process, which the drives express in shudders, flailings, or half gestures that build up tension in response. The body expresses the impulse to discharge this tension and reduce stimulus to nothing. The energy of the drives is a kind of potential energy suggested by affect. The drives are psychic because they have a meaningfulness directed to objects of gratification, but are also somatic because the directed movement is engendered by stimulus. This description of drive, however, already depends on the acquisition of language. Prior to entrance into symbolic life, the drives possess no determinate border between inner and outer. The drives cannot direct themselves toward any object explicitly. For Freud, this undifferentiatedness between inner and outer, or self and object, is of course termed primary narcissism. Primary narcissism, in somewhat imprecise terms, refers to the condition of an infant beginning with the physical separation from its mother. The infant has no means for determining regions, proximal or distal, to its own body, inasmuch as it is always in intimate contact with other human bodies. The more separated the child becomes, however, the more the intolerable frustration of stimulus leads it to view itself as the site of such stimulus. For Freud, this investiture of psychic energy in the self enables the child to direct the focus of its psychic energy onto objects. The acquisition of language enables the child to invest the energy of its drive motility in exterior objects, which quell the buildup of stimulus following upon the infant's separation from the mother. For Freud, the ambivalence and ambiguity of the drives is not abolished, but remains the unconscious force behind the desire for specifically nameable objects in mature life. Kristeva says that the symbol is any joining. No, did I mention this? Sorry. Kristeva says that the symbol is any joining, any bringing together that is a contract, and finally, any exchange. The symbolic serves to unify the drives by dint of being a contract or exchange, meaning that something is lost in exchange for something else. Language regulates the flow of drives into finite ends, which cannot permanently satisfy the drives, but which substitute satisfaction by way of language. Symbols or words stand in for objects which are of necessity absent. Symbols parcel out the barrier between subject and object by checking the drive impulses where they seek a lost union with the source of stimulation. Words are a kind of husk of the primal point of impact with exteriority. Kristeva says that language protects the body from the attack of drives by making it a place, the place of the signifier, in which the body can signify itself through positions. Language thereby determines all contact with exteriority, leaving exteriority itself, what is beyond language, outside the sphere of signification. She says that the inception of the symbolic transcendentalizes semiotic motility by making the body position itself through language. This excludes drive motility from the signifying process explicitly. The symbolic depends on such drive motility, since it can here be seen that it usurps the impulse of the drives in the construction of a linguistic world, but it equally cannot speak to this somatic production because the constitution of the symbolic order consists in a closed association of words. The drive motility engaged in the production of the symbolic is what Kristeva terms, of course, the semiotic. In its relationship to primary narcissism, the semiotic lies in the pre-linguistic meaning and embodied rhythm, gesture, or affect that obtained in the physical proximity between mother and child. However, the semiotic itself has to act on and destabilize the symbolic. Its true place lies in the semiotic chora, which, according to Kristeva, can never be posited. One can situate the chora, but one can never give it axiomatic form. Kristeva construes the chora as a rhythmic space, analogous to vocal or kinetic rhythm. The chora manifests through the body in its potential movement vis-a-vis drive motility. The chora is an uncertain and indeterminate articulation, expressing itself pre-linguistically in the agitative reverberations of the drives throughout the body. The semiotic and the semiotic chora are nonetheless not identical. While the semiotic issues from the chora and permits the chora to jut through the symbolic in its wake, the chora itself remains beyond spatio-temporal determination or representative efforts in concepts and propositions. The semiotic remains inextricably caught up in the symbolic. It represents the body in its proto-symbolic transition to the symbolic as a precondition. In modern artistic practices, particularly poetry, the elements of expression, language, are deployed by means of rhythm or tone to convey something unique to the tonal or gestural position of the words in the poem rather than to their propositional content. For Kristeva, this is a deployment of the semiotic through the symbolic. Language is not merely negated in this act, but its normal functioning is destabilized and dislocated. The deployment of the semiotic in poetic language engenders a resumption of the functioning characteristic of the semiotic chora within the signifying device of language. Semiotic chora comes to expression by way of the deployment of the semiotic through the symbolic in poetic language or in modernist art. Fragmented elements of a stable system are heterogeneously configured, recalling the moment at which the body is elevated to the site of signification, or otherwise two heterogeneous systems of signification sharing similar elements are sort of, the element is sort of used in both registers, causing a kind of disruption that recalls the chora. This accomplishes what Kristeva calls a transposition, the destruction of the old position and the formation of a new one, the transition from one symbolic to a new one in which the new signifying system may be produced with the same signifying material of the old one. As a kind of praxis, this deployment of language destabilizes the ideological complicity with norms and practices that both suppress access to the semiotic and thereby the capacity to articulate the suffering undergone in modern life. For Beardsworth, the abstracted character of the semiotic which Kristeva provides in Revolution in Poetic Language remains too close to a theory and praxis framework. Psychoanalysis, as it is subsequently modified, is the theory capable of diagnosing the ills of bourgeois life through the practice of modern art. In the later texts of the 80s, however, the theoretical accounts are wedded to their practice through analyses of case studies and works of art. Inasmuch as the semiotic cora functions here as a reconfigured kind of materiality, it destabilizes such notions of a clear divide between theory and practice as those found in Marx's classical form of materialism. In fact, when juxtaposed, Kristeva's formulation of the symbolic complicates the account given by Marx. In the next section, I turn to Marx's account of alienation in Capital, Volume 1, to further draw out these elements and then transition to his account of commodity fetishism to sort of wrap it all up. For Marx, revolution or resistance is modeled on the primacy of labor in human existence. This is just the classical account. Labor is not only the source of economic value, but the source of all human value and meaning in the first place. For Marx, such value is typically use value, which does not come down to the same thing as utility. Marx portrays use value in terms of the metabolism it represents between humanity and nature. Use value is realized in a process of self-externalization. As Marx puts it, labor has become bound up in its object. Labor has been objectified. The object has been worked on. What on the side of the worker appeared in the form of unrest or unruhe now appears on the side of the product in the form of being, sein, as a fixed, immobile characteristic. Through labor, the human being works with nature and produces an object whose existence sustains the human. Through labor, nature becomes one of the organs of human activity. Prior to labor, human existence is nothing more than the potential for labor in unrest. Human beings must work on nature in order to exist or to be at all. By working on nature, humanity gets itself back in the process. So Marx asks, so let's see, later on I mean to return to the issue of use value and its, Later on I mean to return to the issue of use value and its transition to exchange value. For now I will examine the creation of profit as a usurpation of this value. Marx asks how the capitalist is able to gain profit from the circulation of goods. Since value remains realizable only in the use of the products of labor, under the model of use value, the capitalist has to find some way of generating value without losing anything. In order to do this, the capitalist must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. Since for Marx here, the sole source of value is labor, the capitalist can only obtain such a commodity if labor is sold on the market as itself a commodity. That is, labor must be detached from its realization in the use value of its product and sold as a capacity, which in turn is valued merely by the cost of making it available for use. This can only happen once products of labor become commodities, objects whose value is determined by the materials and labor time taken to produce it. This involves exchange value, which I will return to here soon. The important point is that the capitalist can gain money only by not devaluing labor, can gain money only by devaluing labor. Laboring under capitalism, the worker does not externalize herself in order to get herself back. Only unrest remains. The capacity to labor is sold, returning nothing other than the means to generate that capacity again the next day. Profit can only come at the cost of estrangement of the realization of human value in labor. While the capitalist gains profit from the transaction, the effect not only estranges the worker from labor, but engenders an attenuated form of value for all classes, which remains estranged from its origins in labor. Labor still generates the value which capitalism exploits, but it thereby detaches laborers from the product of their labor. For Marx, the key to overcoming these circumstances turn on a restoration of propriety for the product of labor to the laborer. That is, the laborers are supposed to revolt themselves, thereby putting the agency of social existence into sync with the products of their activity. Practice overthrows the ideologically false consciousness of value detached from all acknowledgement of its material source. Though Marx is at pains to distinguish materiality from mere empiricism, his conception of praxis recapitulates a structure of determination, and this is where it gets problematic, which is at least analogous to the determination of efficient causality. For Kristeva, even at the stage of revolution in poetic language, does not share this view. However, the aspect of exchange value and its symbolic capacity may reveal alternative readings of this process, which Kristevan terms will help to clarify. So for Kristeva, the transition from use value to exchange value further complicates Marx's account of materiality and estrangement insofar as it can be considered in terms of a symbolic system characteristically elevating its material semiotic components. The application of Kristeva here is not without precedent. Marx's account of the origin of exchange value, money and commodity fetishism, entails the process of valorizing a product of labor, similar to the usurpation of drive motility in the process of making the body a site for signification. The value of labor and of objects produced by labor originally manifests in the use of the product itself. The value of the labor involved in growing my own tomatoes actualizes itself in my consumption of said tomatoes. The value of the tomato itself is in its consumption. Means and ends form a unifying kind of metabolism here. However, when my tomatoes are not enough, though I have an abundance and I, say, need eggs, I may be able to trade some of the surplus tomatoes for eggs with my neighbor. Through the common denominator of specific expenditures of time and labor, the tomato can be rendered as equivalent in value to the egg. If it takes less labor to produce more tomatoes, then the quantity of tomatoes equal to a dozen eggs will be greater than a dozen. This method of exchange becomes prototypical for exchange across greater expanses of space, higher levels of production, growth in population, etc. At a certain point of expansion, certain commodities come to stand as equivalents for a varied range of commodities. At this point, the equivalence is still reversible. An ear of corn can be worth a potato, or a potato can be worth an ear of corn, depending on the number of produce available. Value is still realized in the exchange of use values here. Exchange value begins when one commodity becomes a universal equivalent as currency. Marx says that a particular kind of commodity acquires the form of a universal equivalent because and insofar as all commodities except one are thereby excluded from the equivalent form. Its value is expressed relatively in the infinite series of all other physical commodities. A single product of labor becomes valorized to the point that expresses all value within a possibly infinite range of commodities. At this stage, exchange value arises as a value expressed for all commodities, but inhering in only one, which thereby excludes all other commodities from its sphere and can no longer see its origin arising from the material process of labor. But precisely the product of labor is what bears this function. While exchange value purportedly represents the value of congealed, that is processed and liquidated labor expenditure, it is cut off from the use value in the product itself because it is never consumed but only exchanged. Furthermore, it cuts off labor from realizing itself in the use value of its products. For Marx, despite its estranged status, labor remains the force which is usurped by this process. I argue, however, following Kristeva, that specifically the capacity of money to create a value which is cut off from the sphere of the influence of labor is a condition for the possibility of profit that Marx perhaps leaves underemphasized. This must be the case if labor, as the referent of the commodity in its form as money, itself remains one commodity among others in the infinite range of commodities. This does not cut exchange value off from a labor which manifests value, but severs the ties of exchange value from all connections to a material world of objects. In short, and this is where Kristeva becomes more salient, the valorization of the commodity to the money form constitutes the symbolic, represents a kind of thetic break at the expense of a materiality which the dream of an unalienated labor quells, as equally as the dream of profit. Both guard the border of the symbolic system of exchange as imaginary constructs of satisfaction for an intimacy with exteriority that cannot be articulated or regained. Here I am maintaining Marx's position that the usurpation of value echoes out ideologically into the constitution of culture, religion, and subjectivity. But the engine of this does not lie in an alienated human activity, but rather in its capacity to exclude all understanding of materiality from any sphere of human existence. The more the value of these existences can be translated into activities bearing value that can be divided and micromanaged. The symbolic function of money, the fetishized commodity, functions like a narcissistic wound that draws all value into its sphere only to spit it back out as degraded. The idea of labor falls short as a material recourse here because labor is already constituted by the language of value. It is a myth retroactively projected onto the pre-monetary, pre-civilized forms of life, which bore the brunt of an intolerable exposure to exteriority. While Marx is right in wanting to conceive materiality as a kind of openness to nature, he wrongfully emphasizes the moment of Sein, that is from Unruhe to Sein, that is of the fashioning of a stable product, over the moment of Unruhe, Unrest. probably the more material concrete moment in human life, refers to the pre-linguistic exposure to exteriority, in which no boundaries between inner and outer exist, in which efforts toward externalization are often flailing and uncertain. Unrest or agitation in the face of an overwhelming exteriority in which I can make no distinction between myself as recipient or cause of stimulus because of my intimate proximity to my caregivers captures the idea of an ambiguous materiality. The use value of the object, however, has already gone through conceptual mediation by the worker in his skillful engagement with nature. Labor already exists under a structure of mastery through signification. Okay. Here's where things get a bit more. I've got a minute. Okay. Okay. Well, let me just read then some of the stuff, the way I see Kristeva kind of adding more to the discussion about materialism. Here I have 3 blurbs that refer directly to her essay, Semiotics, Critical Science and or Critique of Science. First of all, Kristeva argues that Marx provides another possibility, inasmuch as he clearly does not think use value restores humanity's self-loss, for using the language of political economy to critique itself in order to gesture at what it cannot say. This manipulation of language itself recalls or calls up the gestural embodied ground for all communication as such. So that's one point. The next, Kristeva's dialectical materialism is Marxist, but emphasizes the process from use value to exchange value and from commodity to currency in order to arrive at a depiction of what makes work possible, that is, a concept of a work that means nothing and of a silent production that marks and transforms while remaining prior to all circular speech to communication, exchange, or meaning. That is, the valorization of the commodity that makes it function as a sign in a system of communication is not itself produced by labor in the classical sense, but by this form of mute production, which Kristeva gestures at, which is material but not mechanistic, not realist, not something we can point to. This emphasizes unrest over being. Calling it silent means that it is not a determinative force or violence as such that produces objects. Kristeva's materialism therefore does not rest on providing an exertion of force outward in order to satisfy natural needs, but rests in the dispersal of speech and communication across a body at odds with its own indeterminate boundaries in rejection, abjection, and loss. The semiotic is not a natural labor-producing signifiers, but rather resembles the process by which a commodity, a concrete use value, is lost as it becomes currency, as it sheds itself of explicit value in its concrete qualities and becomes a value for exchange. Thus, the work and production of the semiotic is not naturalized, but represents a new materiality molded from embodiment and linguistics. And I'll just stop there.
And so owing to the universal respect of time, we've got lots of it.
I have a question for the second speaker. I forget your name, sorry.
Markus is fine.
Okay. But I really appreciate all of your speeches. What I was thinking about with what you were saying was in respect to silence and an attempt to try to define instances of revolt or like growth. I noticed that you kept a like Western framework in your resources, and I wonder if you had intent behind that, or if it's just what you were exposed to. And I want to give like an anecdote to show like why it interests me is I was lucky enough to find myself in Shenzhen, China, and we had like an official government tour guide with us. She had dossiers on us, and she was like, "Oh, nice to meet you. I see you study philosophy." And she had this question, like, "How do you study philosophy in school?" I was like, "Well, we read a book, we talk about it." And she said, "Oh, you read? Oh, I thought you would just sit around a room and not talk to each other." And it just blew my mind with the sense of there being a very strong dialectical growth and possibly revolutionary concept to silence being very inherent to that idea of what philosophy is. So I was wondering if there's a reason why you you stayed within, your classical Catholic mystics.
Well, two things. I mean, one is historical or just a matter of source use. I mean, I certainly do not want to disrespectfully pass on the torch of Eurocentrism simply back to Kristeva, even though she has admitted that sometimes she may come across that way. that, because she is, I think, very, maybe proud of the European cultural heritage, without saying that this is all there is. But she herself mentions Catholicism, and some of the characters I involve rather profusely, and so it seems sort of natural to work with her textual emphasis. This being said, I think the beauty of the approach that emphasizes mysticism is that it is by no means sort of locked into the Western tradition. My examples are from the Catholic background, and I think it's nice because Catholicism is such a rich tradition with this very multi-layered institutional network that can be good and monstrous and interesting. But the mystical approach, where we get liquefied in language, I think that's certainly nothing that the West has a unique purchase on. And so, sure, my illustrative material might smack a little of Eurocentrism, but I think the picture it points to is not, simply because there are mystical elements, like you suggested, in various religious traditions, by no means the Catholic one alone. I mean, one book that comes to mind, interestingly, right, one is maybe by Paul Tillich, Christianity in Conversation, I think it's called. And that's sort of like a nice way to check on the possible links, even though in the end he will say that there's a point where the Christian pastor and the Zen Buddhist will part ways, because in his mind Protestantism is inherently more political than maybe Zen Buddhism. But this being said, I'm happy to say that mysticism has its tentacles in different world religions.
Sure. Yeah, if I could follow up real quick. I just think it's especially fruitful in light of trying to find like a secular appreciation of the divine. And Nietzsche so long ago predicted that Buddhism would spread, and I think it's for just this type of concept that it is, or something like a Buddhist appreciation with the secularness to it. So
I can only agree that I think it's a rich research area, because if you take these paradoxical sounding designations of Kristeva's, this atheistic but sacred. I mean, I didn't use it in this paper so much, but I'm still thinking of her as a Catholic atheist, and that's not a contradiction in terms necessarily, right? It just sort of looks for a different spirituality, and I think it is potentially transcultural, or it has a certain sort of spiritual cosmopolitanism going for itself. But one has to start somewhere. I think it's just, to sort of see closer to home, where were there already traces in our own tradition, and once we have those identified, then we can sort of start comparing to other cultures or other religions.
So my question's for Daniel. So thanks for the paper. There's a lot of really interesting work that you're doing in there. I found myself a little bit. I lost the thread, and no doubt it is my fault with the beautiful sun shining in and wanting to be
blame.
End of the conference. But a little bit of inattention here at the end. But okay, so I see you at the end. Maybe are you using Kristeva to critique Marx? I see this parallel to the way that Eurydise uses Levi-Strauss to critique Marx in Women on the Market. And I don't know if that's a direct parallel, but okay. So I've got you right here that you're pointing to this sort of the semiotic as a kind of material production that precedes and conditions economic production. So you are using Kristeva to critique Marx.
Yes.
And okay, so and then can you could you help me? So the first move that you wanted to make, though, was bringing together the work in the 80s and Revolution in Poetic Language. So can you just help me with the thread there? How is it that you're drawing
putting
that back into Revolution in Poetic Language?
So what I went in the idea of materialism and revolution in poetic language is something similar to what Beardsworth says is going on in the 1980s trilogy, which is the possibility for articulating the loss of loss. And Beardsworth says that this is something that the early account doesn't allow for. The early account seems to valorize one historical trajectory. And so, based on some of the writings that take place in Semiotics, a critique of science or critical science, my thought there is that, in fact, she's already anticipating a kind of loss, which estrangement and alienation in standard Marxism does not encapsulate. And so she also says in that essay that semiotics can only get off the ground as a critique of semiotics. And so on the one hand, she's emphasizing Marx, but I believe that she's sort of using Marx's own language to try and disrupt itself and make it point to something that it itself has lost,
Okay.
right, as a means for expressing. And this is this pre-productive idea of labor as silent production. And I think this is helpful for seeing the semiotic in a way that works with the later stuff.
Okay.
And it's not,
So-
yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That's really helpful for getting the pieces
Yeah.
together. So,
Yeah.
So what do you think of this analogy to Eurydice? Do you have thoughts on where we might situate gender in this discussion? Is there a way that you're thinking in that direction?
Well, I would turn to Eurydice for that account, most definitely, as far as how gender is bound up in this process. I guess I haven't had enough time to really think this through, but I'm concerned that maybe in Kristeva's case, the account of gender is harder to figure out. I mean, certainly there's the emphasis on the maternal and the idea that the Cora has some femininity to it, but exactly in what way is somewhat ambiguous, I think. So I am very much interested in trying to bring those two accounts together, though, and if anybody has any thoughts on that as well, I'd be really happy to hear it. But I wonder if at least the Kristeva, who has said that feminism represents an effort for phallic power, wouldn't have a kind of problem or feel a kind of incompatibility with the Eurydice's account in Women on the Market, but I'm not sure. So I'm sorry if I didn't answer that more, but.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Well, I have a question for Markus. I think this silent stuff is just great. I'm wondering if you could pull something out a little more for me. When I think about silence, I think most about Black Sun, in which she says, if I can no longer metaphorize, I become silent and I die. And silence is a thing, like silence is the marker for the collapse of meaning. And then you've got the liberation theologian whose name I don't remember, silence has a double meaning, right? And so religious prayer as a choric practice of silence, especially with the long Butler wind-up, risks becoming a positivity and not choric. So could you maybe talk about how, and yet the mysticism is clearly sort of getting there. So.
Okay, let me try, and you can also cut me off if I'm sort of being off point. What sort of riffing off of Zölle, right? That it remains sort of ambivalent, right? I mean, I'm not saying, and I don't think that any of the people I quote is saying that silence is the sort of win-win technique that has only beneficial aspects in our life. But I do think because it has this sort of demonic, double-edged quality, that's what makes it in a way subversive. And what I was trying to do with this paper, and maybe since everybody has to cut off parts, right, and then it looks a little ugly. The dilemma is the charge of displacing politics, right? I mean, like we heard other speakers and also the keynote speakers say that some people, including maybe Terry Eagleton, have worried that this is all very nice, but it's fluffy, and by the end of the day, if you don't have a robust class consciousness or affiliate yourself with a movement, then this is not going to help anybody on the ground. It always reminds me actually of Cornell West when he lashes into Frederick Jameson in Keeping Faith, basically saying, yeah, Jameson is pretty slick, but he hasn't really managed to attach himself to any movement, so, right? And so, but what I want to say is that if you look at these real-life cases of how people use these practices that are not directly revolutionary, right? It is not the demonstration in the street. It is more subtle, if you will, or more secluded, but they can have, I think, powerful ripple effects, right? So that's what I was trying to explore, that where and how can you find in Kristeva, well, I keep saying techniques or strategies, where you find material for a cultural politics of resistance that answers the accusation that this is sort of not powerful enough if you face anything like fascism or, I don't know, like dark Maoism. And I think, well, look, I mean, these people have stood up to strong institutional structures, sometimes from within, sometimes from without, but they could only do that by himself toying with dangerous things, and silence is one of those, right? And Kristeva, does say what you said in this book and elsewhere, that silence is not just peaceful by itself. It can also turn on you, but I guess you have to play with fire a little bit in order to get anything going. And I think in all its ambiguity, and Maria Margaroni has this nice piece in Hypatia where she talks about the ambiguous or ambivalent, I think ambiguous, legacy of the Korah. You have to toy with something double-edged in order to move anything. And so I thought silence and crying too, right, which is always stigmatized and I think underdeveloped as a technique. I mean, crying is always reactive in my mind in the Western tradition, even if you have not the macho stuff going on. It's only reactive. It is sort of balancing at best. And I wanted to say, well, it's ominously creative.
I wonder then if for you, silence does not have a double meaning, but a meaning and a non-meaning, or songs and non-songs, right?
I think I want to say yes.
I don't know. I'm just floating it, but
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. I have a question that's perhaps related to the question to Markus still, related perhaps to Jeremy's question, and it has to do with your very captivating analysis of the dissolution of speech and mystic silence. I found it very moving, so thank you for that. And I'm curious, I guess I'm curious about how to think about this situation if you're wanting to emphasize singularity there, right? Kind of an emphasis on singularity and a kind of a retrospection, right? In the way Kristeva was talking about it, or is there also a relation to transcendence implied within this position, right? Which would perhaps connote the sacred and which would then not only be like a movement within the self, but also out of the self towards the transcendent, right? So how are you kind of mapping out this mystical speech situation? Is my first question.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not completely sure about the transcendence, but on the way to answering your question, I would say that, and I didn't quite say that in the paper, so you couldn't have guessed. But
or perhaps can I?
Yeah,
can I
please.
just say,
Sure.
Because I guess because you're emphasizing prayer, and it
Mhm.
seems to me that prayer implies this relation to an otherness of some kind,
Yeah.
right? Even if it's a non-religious sacred or whatever we want to call it, right? It seems that the turn is not only retrospective, but also this sort of this projection out of the self, right? To
Yeah.
some kind of alterity. So is this how you're thinking about it? And and is the semiotic core kind of thematizable in these ways? I always sort of struggle with how to think about the core, how to think about the semiotic. Are they individual? Are they kind of intracorporeal, or are they relational too? So that's just kind of where the questions coming from.
Okay. No, thank you. That helps. Well, I do have to say, maybe to answer with a quote that was not in my presentation, but there's another gripping quote which I think speaks to that by Kristeva. This is from The Sense and Nonsense of Revolt, and there she would say this, right? In other words, this quote, in other words, language is an immanent God, unless you would prefer to think of God as a metaphorical extrapolation of immanence. The secular belief, whose foundations we are still seeking, which must neither be too reductive nor too lethal. Apparently a little lethal is okay. might be described as this. With language, we will be able to think about the meaning of a statement such as God is within us, and if God is within us, it is because we are speaking beings. And so it's very, unquote, so it's very tantalizing because, I mean, this quote, God is within us, it almost sounds like the Quakers, right? Or the mystics. And I'm not sure about the transcendence. I mean, you know, like all the other continental thinkers that are in the background, neither wants to commit to transcendence without qualification. So you get always transcendence with a qualifier. And, well, this is how she puts it here, right? You can think of it as an immanent God, but, you know, at the same time, you have to qualify it. If I were to give it a label, it sounds very much like panentheism to me, which is a horrible phrase, but it's different from pantheism, which sounds like you're reducing God to everything or turning God into some sort of natural omnipresence. And panentheism says that God is more than everything. So he is, the divine pervades everything, but is not exhausted by all there is. So you don't collapse it, right? So I would say it's a perfusion model, and that's what makes it close to the Korah. So there's divine sparks. It almost sounds like Martin Buber. There's divine sparks in us and between us and in things. And it's difficult to say whether you can pray to them, but you can put yourself in touch with, I guess, divine energies, if that doesn't sound too soapy. And you can tap into it, and it can give you a creative charge that can be dangerous, but that we have divine sparks in us. And that's something that Benjamin would endorse coming out of Hasidic Judaism. It's the idea that the divine has been splintered and dispersed and is pervading the world as we know it, and that's also what makes matter not just matter. It's not your classical God of monotheism, but you can communicate with it, and you can, why not call it prayer?
Can I ask a quick follow-up? So what's the ethical dimension of this then? Because I guess this is the one part of your paper that I wasn't quite clear about, is this connection to ethics and ethical violence. How, what's the connection? What's the ethical dimension of this?
That the challenge, starting, I mean, one can use Margaroni. Margaroni in this 2005 article, she says that there's this familiar double bind, philosophical double bind. The problem is that if you perceive anything like an evil or social injustice or a case of oppression or suffering, right, then if it's part of your environment, there's sort of like a dilemma, because either if you try to take on the enemy head on, you are sort of complicit in the discourse of the enemy, right? If you try to extract yourself from the discourse, then you are otherworldly and you probably have no effect on the situation, right? So either you are innocent but useless, or you are effective but complicit. And that's the double bind. And the question is, how do you break out of this? And for example, how do you try to change the Catholic Church from within, right? And these women, I think these reformers, they did it, but they had to liquefy themselves, right? I mean, sort of, they had to give up their identity, but in a rather peculiar way, by going into this amorphous domain, and they didn't know how they would come out of it, right? So that's the ethical violence that the standard move is you're like Habermas, yeah? You project a social utopia and you try to work for it. We may all fail, but there's a linear vision about what a better society would look like, and you try to make it happen. But with these guys here, or with these social actors, you don't have a linear trajectory, so there's no guarantee that you will make things better. There's no guarantee that you will become a better person. If you enter this cauldron of language, you might come out a monster, right? But you have to take the risk, otherwise you will not be able to break out of this double bind, if that helps.
Right,
Yeah, question. And then probably after that, not that there's anything else. But
I have a question for Sarah. I thought your paper was it's a really very lovely walking us through how the story of Orpheus and Eurydice is used by Kristeva to illuminate and critique Arendt. But near the end, you said that Kristeva only hints of the retelling of the Orpheus story. So there's at least in your presentation, you're not able to work in sort of reciprocal way, and how this story could also illuminate from the other side, Kristeva. And so have you thought about that, of using this to go in both directions, and to use it not against her, but to illuminate her contrast, and not just her critique of Arendt, but what we learn of Kristeva's own work from that critique? Does that make sense to you?
I think so. I tried to gesture at that somewhat.
Right, you did, but I'm
Right.
saying now you have a little chance to say a little bit more.
I think so. So I think she sort of takes Arendt's analysis, but also she's looking at sort of the limits of Arendt's analysis, and trying to show that those limits are actually what allow for Arendt to have such an interesting reinterpretation of the myth. And so part of her sort of, I don't want to call it a critique exactly, because it's almost not a critique, because she always uses these sort of hypothetical critical statements like, one could criticize Arendt for this, or we could say this, but then she wants to kind of say, well, no, but I think actually Arendt's reasoning is a little bit more subtle here, or these kinds of things. And so, so of course, part of her critique, I'll put it in scare quotes, is a familiar one that we face when we read Arendt, which is a feminine kind of critique, a feminist critique, where Arendt, I mean, just through her constant usage of the male, masculine, you know, the pronoun, and all of these things, and her disavowal of any feminist leanings, and her disavowal of psychoanalysis and things like this. So throughout the Arendt volume, Kristeva mentions these things, but then tries to show how they actually are implicit structurally in Arendt's perspective. And so I think that Kristeva's reinterpretation of the myth is trying to gesture toward the gendered aspect of it, for one thing, but also a sort of psychoanalytic perspective that is trying to show that Arendt sort of disparages what she calls the sufferings of the soul. And she sort of focuses on a dichotomy between the mental activities and then the realm of the public sphere and the who and all of these things in the human condition. And I think Kristeva wants to show that this role of suffering and being lost in this sort of dichotomous split in consciousness, at least in the thinking volume, that's how it comes out, it comes out and it allows Arendt's creative productivity of her ideas and all these kinds of things. So it's implicit, and through that, I think she wants to reinterpret the myth in a less dichotomous way. And so a kind of thinking of Orpheus and Eurydice as being a kind of split, but also the necessity of negotiation between the two poles as being what's really important and necessary for the salvation of both of them. So it's not just that Eurydice is lost, but also Orpheus is lost, because of course I didn't get to this part in the Metamorphoses, but we all know what happens to Orpheus in the end. So it doesn't turn out well for him either. So I think that for Kristeva, she thinks that it's this divisiveness that where you get stuck in one place or the other, and she talks about this in other ways, especially with Arendt, as sort of the termination of questioning, or the failure of thinking and things like this, and this perpetual back and forth between the two. And that's where meaning can be created. And once meaning is lost, then you end up in suicide or psychosis or these things. I mean, she also mentions the Orpheus myth in Black Sun through her analysis of Nerval, who ultimately kills himself. So, and that's something that I'd like to work in, but haven't been able to in this amount of time. So, yeah.
That's great. That sounds very good. Thank you.
Well, I don't want it to end, but it has. And so one more round of applause. Thanks for being here. In cap to what has been for me a pretty wonderful conference.